Welcome to part 3 of the series. In part 2, we reviewed how to remove all the old plumbing lines, be them copper, poly, or whatever you happen to have in your boat. In part 3, we'll actually start to run the new PEX plumbing lines, show details on how to make the PEX connections. Also, we'll show how to create what's called a PEX manifold, a central point of distribution for all the lines, and then even connecting the fixtures. So for us, we start in the bilge, and this is where our central point is going to be located, and we'll run the lines aft toward the head. We found what makes this easier is rolling out enough PEX and straightening it in preparation for the runs. It makes it a lot easier to run the lines. Best to have 2 people, but can be done with 1. Here I'm feeding the PEX lines down my right-hand side aftward toward where Deb is reaching down through the bilge panel from the stateroom, and she's going to guide it over toward the head. We now repeat this same process to all of the locations in the boat back to the central connection point for our plumbing lines. If you made plans and a sketch for your system, as we demonstrated in part 1 of this series, this really is a fairly easy step, and it's just following the bouncing ball. However, it may be pretty messy depending on the condition of your bilge. In our case, it's pretty old, pretty dirty in there, so certainly at times came up with arms that were a bit covered in dirt or grime, and didn't maybe spend the time we needed to this time to clean it all up and paint it. As we run the lines from the forward head, having Deb feed the lines under the sole and with me guiding it along, we learned a few things along the way. First, it's a good idea to run the lines in a place where they will be out of the way. We like to run them a few feet off to the sides of the opening floor panels and where they can still be fixed to hang from the sole, and in a place where they will not rub up against other components. They could be stringers or bulkheads that extend down or other fittings. The other thing we did where possible was we ran the PEX through any openings that might have already been drilled for the old or previous plumbing. Don't forget, if you do this, to be sure to use those protective through-wall clamps that we showed in part 2 of the series to keep from causing any damage to the PEX lines there as well. Now we want to go ahead and run all the lines to that central point location where we'll install the manifolds. In our case, we decided to do it just above the water and diesel tanks underneath the cabin sole, accessible by going underneath the galley cabinet. Figured it was an easy to locate item. We could remove some items from the cabinet, get access to it if we ever needed to do any repairs or additions, and it also was a place where it was completely out of the way. When all the lines are run, it's now time to actually start putting the connections together, whether they're T's or 90-degree connections, whatever it happens to be. Before we show that part of the video, we actually did a demonstration of how to properly crimp and set up one of these tools. Deb's going to walk us through that.
These are the cutters we use for the PEX lines. Line the cutters up on the PEX. After a bit of pressure is applied, rotate the cutters to start a groove. Then use the ratchet action to cut a clean, straight cut all the way through the line. For this, you'll need the PEX, the clamp, your T connector or whatever you're using, and the crimpers for this demonstration. You're going to start by pushing the clamp onto the PEX line a few inches, and then push your fitting into the PEX line until the edge of the cut line butts up against the flat portion of your fitting. When inserted all the way, slide the clamp up so that there is about 1/4 of an inch of PEX exposed, so that your clamp is right about in the middle portion of the fitting being used. Insert the raised portion of the clamp into the end of the PEX crimper, and then use the ratchet action to tighten until the purple LED light comes on. This indicates the correct pressure has been applied. After a few squeezes, the clamp will be locked onto the crimper and you will not need to hold it in place. Here we're doing another example where we're placing the fitting over the PEX, then putting in our joint for the T. Want to make sure you push the PEX line up. Also make sure that the crimping part is not going to be in the way of any of your valves for your plumbing. So here we placed it on the back. And again, place the crimp into the actual crimper. And as you start ratcheting, you'll notice after it gets tight, you can let go of the plumbing pieces. I needed 2 hands to finish it up to get the correct pressure. And here's the light that comes on when you shows that you have the correct pressure on your crimped fitting. To release it, just turn the valve at the top of the crimper. It will release it, and there's your nice fittings. Here's the finished product. We have a nice tight crimp. A small portion of the PEX is still showing, and we have a nice tight seam between the fitting and the PEX.
Thanks, Deb. That was really helpful. So since Deb just demonstrated that, I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward through this section. But this is the assembly of the manifolds. Now you can buy a pre-made manifold from your plumbing supply store or even the big box providers like Lowe's or Home Depot. They run a few $100s, and in our case we only had a few connections, so it didn't make sense to spend the money on that. It was easy enough to make our own out of a few T's and the PEX connections. It is important that you size your lines appropriately. I think I mentioned in part 1 of the video, we did all this at 1/2-inch PEX, which is plenty for the amount of water we're going to be using to our supply ends. The end result of this project is a hot and a cold water manifold. On the cold water manifold, the water comes in from the pressure side right into this section of the connection. The next fitting that aims backward actually goes to the aft stateroom head. The item here though with the large valve on it is the cold water supply to the input side of the hot water heater, and the white component here is a check valve that's a one-way valve to only let water go into the hot water heater and not back out. The next connection down actually runs the water to the galley sink, and then the last one on the end actually runs the water to the forward head and shower. The beauty of a system like this is you can see how easy it would be to add additional inputs here. I could just cut the PEX off of the very far end where the supply line is and add as many T's as I needed. Now it's just a matter of making all the connections to the ends. So I'll start in the forward head, and I have my excess line here. I'm just going to cut it to the length that I need it. And in this case I'm actually doing T's here. They're going to tee into the shower compartment, and then also put a small valve on this to turn off the water supplies for the hot or cold underneath the forward head sink. So cutting these off, and then we'll move on to the shower. So I cut off the small segments of line that I would need to go from the shower compartment through this opening in the bulkhead over to the sink connection where they'll be teed off. And once you get the hang of making these connections, they really go quick. It'll take you a minute or two per connection. You'll spend more time planning out and straightening out the piping than you will to actually make any of the connections. We then crimp on the cutoff valves and the clamps that affix these things to a bulkhead underneath the cabinet. And now it's just a matter of repeating in the other head and at every connection point. As you go ahead and test these out, make sure you dry fit your new fixtures as well. In our case, we had to widen one of the openings in the marble cabinet in the owner's stateroom head so that the plumbing lines would fit down through the single opening. Pretty easy to do. They sell a special bit just for this. Now that we're all ready with the size of the hole, it's time to install the fixture. So we install both of the plumbing lines down through the countertop, and then we want to align this so that the bolts that are going to mount to the bottom side of the cabinet are secured and in place. So now that we go underneath the cabinet, you'll be able to see we have the two lines run down through it along with the two mounting bolts that protrude down through the cupboard. A little tough to do this without seeing, but now it's time to install the attachment point down below. In our case, it was a metal washer shaped item with a rubber coating on it so that it wouldn't scratch this if it were marble or something like that on the bottom side. We just put those in and finger tighten them, and I finger tighten them until I get this just about all the way put up in place, only because it's a little bit challenging given the space and the angle you have to reach into this for so to actually be able to tighten the bolts. But it's just a matter of running these things up tight so that the faucet fits well and is in place and aiming in the right direction for you over the top of the sink. You'll want to go ahead and repeat this process to all of the fixtures you have on your boat. In our case, we had the forward head, the aft head, the galley, a cold water supply line underneath the galley sink, the forward shower, and the rear shower. I'll admit, this part of the project actually takes quite a bit of time. By the time you install the spigots and faucets at all the locations, you're ready to get back out on the water. So take out the boat, enjoy a little bit of time on the water, a little bit of wind in your face, and join us next week for the last and final part of this 4-part series on replacing the plumbing in your boat. Safe sailing! I figured we'd play a few bloopers for you. I'll just put the screen black, but voiceover work is tough and a lot of mistakes get made, so there's a few comical errors as we started putting this together. Enjoy! In part 3, we actually now start to
Up a quarter of an inch of the PEX exposed so that your clamp is right about that's. And use the ratchet action until ratchet action to tighten the perfect word. The word is killing me. You will not need to help. You will not need to help. What the heck?
For the last and final part of this 4-port series, on, doggone it, I keep saying port. Part series on replacing the
We hope you enjoy these videos. We hope you find them useful, entertaining, or just something to laugh at. And if you do, please do subscribe, share it with your friends on social media, and please click a thumbs up and a like for us. That really helps. Thanks. Have a good one.